You're listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, go to nakedbiblepodcast.com and click on the support link in the upper right-hand corner. If you're new to the podcast and Dr. Heiser's approach to the Bible, click on New Start Here at nakedbiblepodcast.com.
Welcome to the Naked Bible Podcast, episode 454, 1 Samuel, chapters 8 through 10, part 1. I'm the layman, Trey Strickland, and he's the scholar, Dr. Michael Heiser. Hey, Mike. How you doing?
So today, but we'll power through it. We got something interesting to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. Covering 3 chapters here, part 1. Looking forward to it. But before we get into it, Mike, real quick, we need to give a shout out to our sponsor, Logos, if you don't mind, and talking about Logos 10, and specifically the new version that's out. And what more can we say that we have not already said? But you've mentioned it, and we've mentioned it numerous times that, you know, if you want to dive deeper into biblical study of any nature, prepping for a sermon or just understanding a difficult passage or, you know, having a reading plan, or, you know, you could do all that and more with the study tools and theological library in Logos 10.
Yeah, and in this case, you know, as I always recommend people, you know, get into Logos, get into the ecosystem with a small base package, and then start adding the things that you want. In this episode of the podcast, we're going to be really interacting with 2 scholarly journal articles, both of which are available in Logos. So that isn't true for lots of journals, but you know, other than getting access to journals through library databases, you know, maybe in your town or local university or something like that, Logos is actually a solution for that, you know, at least to a large extent. They have dozens of journals available in the format, and so we're going to be using some of that today.
Perfect, absolutely. And you can find the best package for you by going to logos.com/nakedbible. You know, with it, you can uncover biblical insights, whether you have 5 minutes or 5 hours. And the new Logos is lightning fast on your desktop, web, mobile, anywhere you can access it. It has a sleek, modern look that helps you focus on what matters, Scripture, and it's endorsed by so many people, including Dr. Heiser here on our show, as he just mentioned. So, live in the world with Logos 10. Visit logos.com/nakedbible to find the best Logos package for you. And again, we want to thank them for sponsoring our show. All right, Mike. Well, with that, I'm interested in 1 Samuel 8 through 10.
Yeah, well, this is part 1. Part 1 is the backdrop to the wider issue of kingship in Israel. You know, because when you hit 1 Samuel 8, this is the chapter where Israel asks for a king. And I was always taught, you know, in church, you know, growing up as a teenager, as a new believer, that it was wrong for Israel to ask for a king. And that seems to be what's suggested in 1 Samuel 8. But there's actually a problem with that, because earlier than 1 Samuel 8, like back in the Torah, back in Genesis, for instance, you have positive endorsements of the idea of kingship. And in Deuteronomy, you have rules for a king. So it doesn't seem that kingship itself was wrong. So what's going on in 1 Samuel 8 through 10? Well, in this part 1, we're going to go through the larger issue of kingship. And you know, that's going to form sort of our look at the wider backdrop. And I'm going to interact with 3 scholarly sources primarily. 2 of them are journal articles, and 1 of them is a book. And the journal articles themselves interact with this book as well. So the articles are David Howard, The Case for Kingship in the Old Testament Narrative Books and the Psalms. That was from Trinity Journal, Volume 9, back in 1988. And then David Howard, again, a follow-up article, The Case for Kingship in Deuteronomy and the Former Prophets, in Westminster Theological Journal, Volume 52, Number 1, in 1990. And they're interacting with a book by Gerald Eddy Gerbrandt entitled Kingship According to the Deuteronomistic History, which is part of the SBL, the Society of Biblical Literature dissertation series, back in 1986. So these are going to be our 3 sources primarily, not exclusively, but primarily to interact with as we discuss this whole issue. So by way of introduction, One of Howard's articles, he begins the discussion about kingship in roughly similar ways in both the articles. We might as well include both here. For example, here's one of them. He writes, the issue of God's attitude toward the human institution of kingship in Israel is one concerning which the biblical texts appear, on the surface, to be ambiguous. On the one hand, God blessed the monarchy, and he even chose a kingly line from which to appear in human form. An impressive theology of kingship can be traced throughout the Old Testament and into the New Testament. On the other hand, we read in several texts in 1 Samuel about Samuel's and God's displeasure over the Israelites' request for a king. And it appears that God's granting of a king is a second-best concession to the people's sinful request, much in the way that Moses permitted divorce as a concession to the people's hardness of heart. However, this analogy is not a good one, since God did not bless and use divorce the way he did the institution of kingship. Furthermore, the prevailing pictures of the idea of monarchy in the Old Testament are consistently positive. It is difficult to accept the fact that this view of monarchy was the answer to the apparent tension in the biblical texts is rather to be sought in the reasons for Israel's request for a king, and not in the question of whether God intended there to be a king in Israel at all. Then in another place he writes this, the question of whether God was originally in favor of the institution of kingship in Israel has received much attention among biblical scholars, but often the conclusions reached are less than satisfactory. This is at least partly because the biblical texts themselves would seem to point in opposite directions on the issue. On the one hand, a large body of text portrays the Davidic kingship in very positive terms, and a significant biblical theology arises around it. On the other hand, several texts, particularly in 1 Samuel, appear to be against the institution. The conclusion usually reached concerning the status of affairs, or this state of affairs, is that God was not in favor of the institution, and whatever positive pictures of the monarchy be found in Scripture represent either his gracious accommodation to an inferior ideal or opposing, usually minority, viewpoints within Israel. Neither of these solutions is entirely satisfactory, however. This is particularly so in the view of the predominantly positive view of the monarchy in most of the Old Testament. Now, in both of these articles, Howard interacts heavily with the book by Gerbrandt, as he finds its presentation of kingship, of the kingship problem, persuasive, and I would agree. I'm in agreement with Gerbrandt, and so I would be in agreement with Howard's assessment of it. So here, what we're going to do is we're going to work through those interactions in this episode, and then turn to the details of 1 Samuel 8 through 10 in the next episode. So again, we're going to go through the theoretical stuff, again, just the broad overview here. And then next time we'll hit the details of 1 Samuel 8 through 10. Gerbrandt's thesis is basically that the view in what is commonly called the Deuteronomistic history of the institution of kingship in Israel is essentially a favorable one and not a negative one, as is commonly supposed. The real issue in the biblical texts is what kind of monarchy was to exist or to be exercised, not whether Israel should have a monarchy or not. In Gerbrandt's own words, Israel's king was, quote, to lead Israel by being the covenant administrator. Then he could trust Yahweh to deliver. At the heart of this covenant was Israel's obligation to be totally loyal to Yahweh. The godly king was to lead the people in worship and keeping covenant, and to trust in Yahweh to fight battles. The true reason for the disapproval of the people's request for a king in 1 Samuel 8 was because they wanted a king, quote, like all the nations, unquote. That's 1 Samuel 8:5, 1 Samuel 8:20. A king that would be like all the nations who would, again, quote, go out before us and fight our battles, unquote, 1 Samuel 8:20. Those kings were the closest to the ideal, or those kings who were the closest to the ideal, David, Hezekiah, and Josiah, were ones whom the text especially emphasize as trusting in Yahweh and keeping the law. Now, in Howard's own view, and I'd agree, Gerbrandt's thesis provides a compelling argument in its harmonizing of those texts within the Deuteronomistic history that have appeared on the surface to be anti-kingship and those that are clearly pro-kingship. And since it is the texts within this corpus that appear to be the most anti-kingship, his solution effectively resolves the tension. Toward establishing the coherence of this approach, Howard applies it to narrative books, the Torah, books in the Torah, Ruth, Chronicles, for example, and in the Psalms in one of his articles, and then he applies it to Deuteronomy and the Deuteronomistic history in another. For our purposes, we won't worry about the Psalms. Just think of the Davidic or Messianic Psalms and their positive portrayal of kingship, and you get the idea. The Psalms are very positive when it comes to the kingship. So why do we get what we get in 1 Samuel 8? We've taken note of some of the data in the interviews with David Mitchell. We've talked about some of these Psalms, so we're not going to go back and repeat that material here. This also isn't an exhaustive survey of the passages that could contribute to the discussion. We're just going to pick a few. We're going to need to be more selective for time's sake. So if we go back and look at the Torah, we'll start in Genesis. Howard writes that it is significant that from the very beginning, the promise of kings was given to the patriarchs. On 3 different occasions, God included kings as a blessing, along with other blessings, upon Abraham and his family. For instance, Genesis 17:6 says, I will make you exceedingly fruitful. I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you. Again, that's spoken to and about Abraham. Later in the chapter, Genesis 17:16, I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her. Spoken to Abraham about Sarah. And Genesis 35:11 says, And God said to him, I am God Almighty, be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come from your own body. Again, that was spoken to and about Jacob in this instance. Now, these references are not merely predictions of a negative state of affairs that would obtain at some later time, again, assuming kingship is negative. Rather, they are part and parcel of good things, positive things, the blessings that God intended to confer upon Abraham's line. Genesis 49:10 is another example. Let's just read that. This is ESV. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. This is the famous scepter prophecy, and there are lots of text-critical issues. Some of your English translations might read differently than the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a ruler's staff from between his feet. Some other translations might have something about Shiloh in there. But again, that's because there's a text-critical problem that needs to be resolved. And so what ESV has and what the Net Bible has is just similar to ESV. It's going to be the proper translation. Howard notes of the passage that almost all commentators and translations understand the first lemma, the scepter, and the second, the ruler's staff, by noting the royal imagery of tribute. The evidence of royal imagery in the passage includes the following. In verse 10, we have the depiction of a ruler's arrival. In the second half of verse 10, where the obedience of the peoples is fit only for a king, we read that. Third, in verse 11, where the reference to the donkey anticipates the royal imagery of Zechariah 9:9, in which the victorious king comes riding on a donkey. And of course, there's the New Testament references to Jesus entering into Jerusalem on a donkey, Matthew 21:1-9. And fourthly, the language throughout verses 10 and 11 and 12, indeed all of 8 through 12 in Genesis 49, is typical of a royal oracle in promising peace, prosperity, and uncontested dominion. These are all positive portrayals and anticipatory of a good future for Israel, not something negative. Elsewhere in the Torah, we have Numbers 24:17-19. It's another scepter prophecy. It reads as follows, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. It shall crush the forehead of Moab and break down all the sons of Sheth. Edom shall be dispossessed, Seir also, his enemies, shall be dispossessed. Israel is doing valiantly, and one from Jacob shall exercise dominion and destroy the survivors of cities. Now, that's the end of verses 17 through 19. There's really no way to construe this as a negative view of kingship. Again, this is a star coming out of Jacob, scepter shall rise out of Israel, and it's a good thing because the elect people of God, Jacob, Israel, are going to have kingship. They're going to have power and dominion over their enemies. The third example, and this is outside the Torah, is in the book of Ruth. As is well recognized by Old Testament scholars, the royal context and significance of the book of Ruth derived from the wording of the blessing of Boaz in chapter 4, 11 through 12, and in the Davidic genealogy at the end of the book in Ruth 4, 18 through 22. Both the blessing and genealogy link David with Judah and the patriarchs. Howard writes as follows: the blessing on Boaz does this in at least three ways. First, it mentions two of Jacob's wives, Rachel and Leah, who was Judah's mother. Second, it includes Ephrathah and Bethlehem, which are first juxtaposed in Genesis 35, 16 through 19, in connection with the death of Rachel and the birth of Benjamin, stepmother and brother of Judah, respectively. Third, it mentions Judah himself, the father of Perez by Tamar, who are also mentioned. Ruth herself is to be like all three of these patriarchal wives, who were mothers of a great lineage. In the genealogy, the ancestry of David is linked from Perez to David, including Boaz, Ruth's husband. This serves to link the short genealogy in 4:17 with the mention of Perez in 4:12. The significance of Perez here is that he was the son of Judah, again, the kingly line. Ruth and Boaz, Howard writes, are thus pivotal figures in the Davidic line. The blessing in chapter 4, 11 through 12 shows us their ties with Judah, Tamar, and the patriarchs. The genealogies in 4:17, 18 through 22 show us their ties with David. The emphasis on the patriarchs as a whole serves to highlight the continuities between the Davidic and the Abrahamic covenants, particularly since nothing concerning Moses or the Mosaic covenant is mentioned in the book. Again, outside the Torah, but another good example Howard uses is 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So we've had, again, a number of positive assessments of kingship. Then we get to Chronicles. Scholars and students of Chronicles know that much of the two books concerns David and his dynasty. The chronicler, as a habit, omits negative information about David and Solomon in his accounting of their reigns and lives, therefore presenting an ideal kingship, what life in Israel should have and could have been like had the kingdom not split and had David and Solomon not sinned in the ways they did. Howard summarizes the data as follows. 1st and 2nd Chronicles opens with a massive genealogical section, which begins in chapter 1 with Adam and ends in chapter 9 with the post-exilic community. Shaping of these genealogies and highlights the interest in Judah, the Davidic dynasty, and the institution by David of centralized worship at Jerusalem and the temple. For instance, the introductory section, chapter 1, moves quickly from Adam to Jacob, Israel, and then the body of the genealogical section, chapters 2 through 8, focuses in depth on Jacob's descendants, mostly from the pre-exilic period and particularly from the time of David. David himself, secondly, is the focus of the remainder of 1 Chronicles, chapters 10 through 29, and his son Solomon of the first part of 2 Chronicles, chapters 1 through 9. The remainder of the book focuses on the fortunes of the kingdom of Judah, the heir of the promises of the Davidic covenant in chapters 10 through 36. In particular, the importance of David and Solomon as ones who established the temple and the true cult in Jerusalem is an important theme in 1 Chronicles. Now, the point here is that this is clearly a positive portrayal of kingship. There is no "we shouldn't have asked for a king" lament in any of it. Second Chronicles ends with the hope of the reestablishment of the centralized worship in Jerusalem that David and Solomon had launched. Second Chronicles 36, 22 through 23. As far as the Deuteronomistic history, the Deuteronomistic material, of which 1 Samuel is a part, this material is the core of the issue for many scholars due to the negative portrayals of kingship in Deuteronomy and criticisms of kingship in books like 1st and 2nd Samuel. Since Howard, again, who is an evangelical, and he's not fully committed to the source-critical views of JEDP or of the Deuteronomistic history hypothesis that Deuteronomy is all entirely non-Mosaic. Since that's true, Howard disagrees with Gerbrandt on the authorship issue he opens his second article with in a disclaimer. So he wants to, again, Howard wants to say, he agrees with a lot that's going on in the talk about the Deuteronomistic history, and I would put myself in here as well. But as far as the matter of Deuteronomy having nothing to do with Mosaic authorship, I'm a little more dubious, and I would be there too. Howard writes in one place in one of his articles, the term Deuteronomistic history refers to the books from Deuteronomy to 2 Kings. As used by Gerbrandt and most others, it also assumes some type of unified authorship for all these books in one or more strata of the texts. I use the term here to refer to the same corpus, but I understand the term Deuteronomistic in a descriptive way. In other words, to refer to those books or ideas reflective of the distinctive viewpoints found in Deuteronomy, with no conclusions concerning authorship of Deuteronomy or the other books implicit in my use of the term. Similarly, Gerbrandt speaks of the Deuteronomist to refer to the author of this unified corpus. I would prefer to use a more neutral term such as the authors or editors of the final work. For convenience, however, Howard writes, I use Gerbrandt's term here throughout to avoid the cumbersome device of constantly distinguishing Gerbrandt's use and my own. And that's fair. It's good of him to mention that. Now, Gerbrandt's view is that the Hebrew Bible, including the Deuteronomistic writer or editor, presents a unified positive view of kingship throughout the whole thing. More precisely, he writes that, quote, the correct question with which to confront the Deuteronomist is not whether he was anti-kingship or pro-kingship. Rather, we need to ask what kind of kingship he saw as an ideal for Israel, or what role kingship was expected to play for Israel, unquote. Now, as Howard's summary article points out, Gerbrandt's major contribution in this book is in detailing what type of kingship the Deuteronomist favored. He shows that the function of the God-fearing king was to lead Israel in keeping covenant and to trust God for deliverance. Israel's sin was in asking for a king who would be like those other nations, leading the nation in battle. Now, Gerbrandt states that the king was, again, to lead Israel by being the covenant administrator. Then he could trust Yahweh to deliver. At the heart of this covenant was Israel's obligation to be totally loyal to Yahweh. Unquote. That's page 102 in Gerbrandt's book. Rather than start where most scholars do to study the Deuteronomist view of kingship, they typically start in 1 Samuel 7 through 12, where we're at now. Gerbrandt starts with 2 Kings 18 through 23, and its description of the reigns of Hezekiah and Josiah. The rationale here is that by studying the Deuteronomist's assessment of these two kings, one can best discern the Deuteronomist's attitude toward kingship generally. As Howard notes, of the 20 Judahite kings, only 8 are judged by the biblical writer to have been good kings, and of these, 6 are said to have neglected to remove the high places, these places of worship. Thus, only Hezekiah and Josiah remain in that list, clearly on a higher plane than the others. Of each of these, it is said that there was none like him before or after. That's 2 Kings 18:5, 2 Kings 23:25. A few observations here on Josiah and Hezekiah drawn from Howard's work will suffice. As far as Josiah is concerned, Howard writes that for the Deuteronomist, the central point of evaluation was whether the king, quote, turned toward Yahweh, unquote, in devotion and loyalty or not. Josiah turned to the Lord, turned to Yahweh in 2 Kings 23:25. Second, he notes that the specific phrase found in 2 Kings 23:25 to describe how Josiah turned to Yahweh, quote, with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his might, unquote, is found again in the Deuteronomistic history only at Deuteronomy 6:5, which instructs Israel as to how to love Yahweh its God. This is the desired response of Deuteronomy 6:4, the Shema. Howard comments that, quote, Deuteronomy 5 through 11 present the fundamental requirements of Israel's law, and the Shema represents the heart of this law. Thus, by using this phrase, the Deuteronomist was giving Josiah the highest marks possible. King Josiah had obeyed the law of Moses, unquote. Now, the basis for this high evaluation of Josiah was essentially that Josiah not only turned to Yahweh in his private life, but he acted upon this repentance in public as well. The bulk of 2 Kings 22 through 23 is devoted to the specific reforms that Josiah instituted and how he led Judah in covenant renewal. In all his acts, he functioned as a true leader of the nation. In this respect, he, quote, adopted a role similar to what Moses and Joshua had earlier fulfilled, unquote. He was the administrator or mediator of the covenant in the same way that these two had been. That was a quotation taken from Gibran. As far as Hezekiah goes, like Josiah, Hezekiah was in a category all by his own, 2 Kings 18:5. However, the basis for the high evaluation of Hezekiah is not, as most scholars have supposed, his reforming activities. These are mentioned only twice in 3 chapters, 2 Kings 18:4 and 2 Kings 18:22. Rather than his reforming activity, Gibran well notes that the basis for the high praise is Hezekiah's trusting, the Hebrew word is batach, in Yahweh. This term is found at the core of the Deuteronomist's evaluation in 2 Kings 18:5. Another significant emphasis is on the root davak, to cling. It occurs 10 times in this section, 9 in chapter 18. None of these has to do with trusting Yahweh. In this passage, however, that is precisely the thrust. What Gibran argued and what Howard has summarized is that this type of kingship was desirable, and the goal of kingship all along, to have someone to lead the nation in believing loyalty, someone to be the par excellence example of trusting in Yahweh. Militarily, this meant that the king would follow in the steps of Moses and Joshua, believing that Yahweh would fight for Israel and soliciting his direction in battle. The request for kingship in 1 Samuel 8 was viewed negatively because of the way it was sought and why, and the circumstances of how it was sought. Howard summarizes things this way. The significance of Gibran's work is at least twofold. First, he provides an effective counterargument to the widely held view that the Deuteronomist was anti-kingship. Thus, the way is open for seeing the important theology that developed around the Davidic kingship as having been part of God's intent from the beginning, and not merely an afterthought or a concession to a second-best ideal, or a reflection of David's political dominance. Second, he succeeds in clarifying, in a way that had not been done previously, why Israel's request to have a king, quote, like the nations, unquote, was so devastating to her relationship with Yahweh. It broke their covenantal relationship and deposed Yahweh as Israel's warrior. That's very important. It essentially removed Yahweh from the place of leading Israel in battle. So when, again, in the circumstances in which Israel asked for a king, this is effectively what it did. They forsook Yahweh's role as leader, military leader. It ought not be argued then that the kingship of Israel was wrong or undesirable, generally. The Torah, Messianic Psalms, other passages call for it or presuppose it. Rather, the kingship question was one of kind or type and had believing loyalty to Yahweh at its core. This is certainly part of the logic of each king having a copy of the Torah at their disposal for right living and leadership. This is me now. To me, this whole thesis of Gebrat makes sense out of the idea that the king was supposed to copy out the law for himself, have a copy, and actually produce a copy for himself for his reign. That rule makes sense in light of this whole idea that kingship was good, but the king was supposed to be the ideal leader in terms of believing loyalty in Yahweh. So Deuteronomy 17:18 says this, "And when he, the king, sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law approved by the Levitical priests." Unquote. So that's Deuteronomy 17:18. Of this expectation, and it's really a duty, that the king was supposed to write out his own copy of the law, Jeff Tigay notes in his commentary on Deuteronomy the following. He writes, "And when he sits on the throne probably means as soon as he takes the throne. The study of God's teaching is a duty incumbent on every Israelite from childhood." Deuteronomy 5:1, Deuteronomy 6:6-8, Deuteronomy 11:18-19. The king must continue to study it while in office. It is not to be only a past influence on him, but a current one as well. Since the king is under his own authority, and no one will rebuke him for his actions, and he has the power to harm the people, he must study God's teaching as a safeguard and a constant reminder to subdue his inclinations and obey God. Unquote. So that's Tigay's assessment of that, which I think is quite good. Now, the whole "he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law," Tigay comments on. He says, rather, he translates it, "he shall write a copy of this teaching for himself on a scroll from the one that is in the charge of the Levitical priests. The king makes his copy from the original given to the priest by Moses after he had finished writing it. According to Philo, the king is required to make his own copy because writing makes a more lasting impression than does merely reading." And then he quotes Philo for that passage. Tigay does. So again, I think this is really helpful to show how Israel's king was supposed to be the model of believing loyalty in Yahweh. And when it came to the military, he was supposed to view Yahweh as the one who fights for Israel, one who fights their battles, and he would receive instructions from Yahweh like Moses and Joshua did in what to do. But that is not why Israel asked for a king in 1 Samuel 8. They asked for a king because they want a military deliverer. After all, Samuel in 1 Samuel 7 had just delivered Israel from the Philistines. This is what they want. They want somebody to be like the rest of the nations, to have a king that leads them in battle. And again, that runs contrary to what God wanted kingship to be as an institution. He wanted to be Israel's own warrior, and he would work through the king, but Israel doesn't see that. Israel just sees having a king like the other nations, and that was the problem. Now, to wrap up, again, this sort of kingship was the goal and was always desirable. This is Gebrat's thesis, and I think it's a coherent one given the rest of the scripture around 1 Samuel. We should not let a few comments in 1 Samuel 8 make us forget this. So next time we'll take a look at the people's request for the kingship and how Saul became Israel's king.
I like that practice, Mike King's writing down the law so they don't forget. I think we need to practice that in today's time. I think
wouldn't that be nice if they actually had to write out their own copy of the Constitution?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't know how we get that started.
Yeah,
but, we need to.
Yeah, not a bad idea.
Absolutely. All right, another good one. Looking for part 2 next week. Don't forget to go visit our sponsor, Logos. You can get Logos 10 at logos.com/nakedbible. We look forward to next week, Mike. And with that, I want to thank everybody for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. God bless.
Thanks for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, visit www.nakedbibleblog.com. To learn more about Dr. Heiser's other websites and blogs, go to www.drmsh.com.